Perfect. Today, my guest is Professor Klaus Meyer. I will keep my introduction short to maximize our time with him. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Klaus as a person, then Professor Meyer as a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally as a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I'll skip many of his accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Klaus is a fellow of the AIB. He has published over 80 articles, 9 books, including a famous IB textbook right there at the back. He was the vice president of AIB and chaired the 2014 AIB conference. Currently, he's serving as an area editor of JIBS, and in 2015, he won the Decade Award from JIBS. He's an expert in emerging economies, especially Eastern Europe and East Asia. He studies the influence of local context on the strategies and operations of MNEs in emerging markets. Recently, he extended his focus over China and in international growth strategies. Thank you, Klaus, for joining us.
Nice to see you today.
Thanks. Let's first a personal segment. Can you pinpoint the earliest moment of awareness between domestic versus foreign?
It's difficult to remember what happened decades ago, but if I have to pinpoint one experience as a young person that really triggered interest in international things, it was a journey that we had as 13 or 14-year-olds, me and my brother, with my parents, from Germany to what was then Czechoslovakia, i.e. crossing the Iron Curtain, which was very rare. It was very difficult for people to travel in that direction. It just happened that my dad had a work-related engagement there, and he took the family in. And this experience of seeing Czechoslovakia, which is a very different country in terms of economic development, but also in terms of political system, in my early teens, I think that's sort of very influential in a way in terms of triggering interest in international things, but also interest in the Eastern Bloc as it was, and later connected with, when the wall came down, connected with the interest in the transition economies.
Klaus, how did you choose IB as a field to study IB?
I think that's sort of a long journey. As I was just recounting experience as in my early teens of traveling internationally. At that time, traveling internationally, if you come from a larger family, wasn't so common. In high school, my interests were more sort of politics and history as areas. When it came to choosing what to study, I decided to go towards economics because I didn't want to be a politician, and in history is sort of interesting, but not a foundation for a career. And so then I moved into economics and moved back and forth between economics during my studies. And I think during my studies also started engaging with development economics in particular, because we had a professor who stimulated our thought. Not that he was a big thought leader himself, but the critical thing as a student is sometimes not to have the person who published a lot, but a person who encourages people to develop their own ideas. And so, yeah, I've sort of been interested in development economics. And when I went to PhD, I gradually drifted from economics into business and sort of into strategy and international business. So it's been a journey that I think I haven't really been arriving in the field of international business as a field of study until the end of my PhD.
What was your dissertation about?
Foreign direct investment in Eastern Europe. So we are talking about the early years of transition when the wall came down. And so lots of people at that time were interested in this challenge of how do we build business in operations in a context where central planning was dominant historically, but fell apart very quickly. And so my focus of the thesis was very much on entry modes and how do companies choose whether they invest on their own or with joint venture or things like that.
Perfect. Let's talk about regrets. What is the one thing you wish you would have done, but you didn't?
That's a difficult question. I've done a lot of things. I don't have big regrets. The one thing that I think I should have done when I was in my teens or 20s, I may have spent some time learning an Asian language, because language skills are good foundations for understanding different countries and cultures, right? If you don't speak the language, you're always sort of outside. And I have rudimentary knowledge of some European languages, but when it comes to looking beyond Europe, going into Asia, if I had invested in Japanese or Chinese, that would have been a real differentiator in terms of me understanding different cultures.
True. If you stop doing what you're doing today, what would be your second best alternative career path?
If I stopped what I'm doing today, I probably have to retire because it's too late to start something new. If I can interpret your question two different ways. What would I have done if for some reason academia hadn't been open to me? I'd probably be in some policy advisory sort of role, or possibly international institutions such as World Bank or United Nations, something that interested me when I was young. If, on the other hand, if you frame the question as what would you do after you retire, which I don't expect to happen anytime soon, but I think I might write a history book on specific history topics I'm interested in.
Interesting. And last question in the personal segment, what are you most passionate about and proud of?
I think there's different questions. In terms of professional accomplishments, you mentioned the Decade Award. I think in our community, the Decade Award is a particularly important award, because it sort of signals that you've written something that other people find really interesting. And in our case, it was a paper sort of that integrates the literature on Central and Eastern Europe and tries to tease out the bigger lessons for scholarly debate, but also in a way given legitimacy to more research on transition economies more generally. And I think that contributes why it's been widely cited. What am I passionate about? Taking the community forward. And I mean, at my stage of career, it's more about bringing people together, facilitating conversations, rather than me driving research projects myself, and sort of make sure the AIB, whose logo is, sorry, one problem with Zoom is that you always have, it's not a mirror image, so I have to use this finger. Okay, that's the AIB logo here, to take the AIB forward in terms of bringing new people in and making sure AIB stays relevant. And I think we'll talk about what relevant means in terms of research questions a little bit later. Yeah, and on the other hand, of course, I should talk about that logo as well, because I'm working in a business school and trying to have conversations with budding managers, early stage or mid-career stage managers, about why international business is important, what are the challenges you face internationally, make people look beyond their horizon. Most people come with a horizon that is their national horizon, or maybe a little bit more, but really get people to think more broadly about the issues they're addressing. And that means, in most contexts, that means thinking beyond the national boundaries. I think when it comes to teaching, that's really the main driver for me whenever I go into a classroom that has the word international in the course title.
Let's just naturally, you're progressing towards research. In your opinion, what are the omitted variables, the least studied or least developed areas in IB?
I think in international business, historically, IB has been very much interested in the relationship between business and government and regulatory differences. If we go like 1970s and 80s, sort of the time before I came, also the beginning of transition economies. We are now focusing, even though we talk about international business, we talk about strategies, maybe talk about operations, but these political variables, political influences, I don't think our understanding has evolved as much. And I think that focusing more on these cross-national political or institutional variables is important, and that has to do with the globalization tension that we are seeing. The regulatory environment is changing a lot for the last, from 1990 to about 2007 or so. We've seen a trend towards liberalization. Now it's been stagnating, in some areas going backwards. So businesses need to understand how we deal with increased uncertainty with respect to political and institutional variables. And I don't think as IB we have that much to say on that. So I think it's if we think about research agendas, focusing on those political variables and also political institutions, supranational institutions is important.
When I'm doing these chats with friends, it's almost split in half. Some people say globalization is going to be the main driver going forward, and some are, and my new research is actually on the other side. We are on the increased nationalism, populism side. What's the prediction? What's your prediction on the next big questions in IB?
Whether you mean whether it's globalization is continuing or backtracking?
Yeah.
This is one of the most difficult questions. I'd love to avoid giving a clear answer on that, because what we need to be aware of is that there are high risks, that some of the existing institutional infrastructure, legal infrastructure that then enables business breaks down, and uncertainty increases, and tensions between countries that have intensive trade relationships suddenly increase. I mean, Brexit is an obvious example where we have a political process that leads to an outcome that makes everybody worse off by economic criteria. There are risks that this happens elsewhere too, especially the US versus China relationship. Despite the change in the leadership in the US, the risk of China and US increasing their tensions and in consequence creating barriers to trade to each other, and possibly even creating tensions that spill over into other countries, whether it's Canada, whether it is Europe, whether it's countries in Southeast Asia. The risk of the tension spilling over and causing trade to be disrupted, value chains to be disrupted, is quite significant.
What do you think about, or let me ask you differently, where does your creativity come from? How do you come up with these interesting research questions, new areas that open up new conversations?
I'm not sure I'm particularly creative. The most creative thing I've done recently is build a snow line. You know, trying myself as snow sculpturing. I think writing is important in the research process, because it's not just about having interesting empirical findings, it's about communicating the findings. In terms of finding research questions, I think it's important to be in touch with the real world. Okay, so I'm not also speaking as an editor, for example. If I see papers where I have the sense that the authors know something about data sets and they crunch the data sets and they've read all the literature, but doesn't have anything to say about the real world, then I'm not terribly interested, right? And I think there is a tendency, especially the way we train PhD students, or especially the way we focus PhD training on writing papers as opposed to developing understanding and models to explain real world phenomena, is leading in that direction. So the most creative ideas in terms of research come from studying real world issues, which could be things like simply reading the newspaper regularly, but also studying specific cases. Now, I'm not a qualitative researcher, although I have some papers that are qualitative in nature, but my focus is not qualitative. But if I talk about cases, I'm thinking about writing cases for teaching purposes. That gives me an entry into a new area. And often out of this work of both interacting with practitioners, reading the newspapers and writing cases, that's where the interesting research questions come from. Right, so more generally speaking, a lot of people think about it, or reviewers ask you, where's the gap in the literature? Mm-hmm. I think that's the wrong question. I think the interesting question often is, where's the gap between what our theories can explain and what you see in the real world? Is there a new phenomenon that our theories cannot explain? Or is there some pattern that you see happening which is different than what you would expect based on the theory? That's the starting point for really interesting research questions. And maybe that also answers your question about creativity. So creativity is often about making lateral connections between things that are not obviously connected. But then, of course, you have to make the argument to publish a paper as to why things are connected. Right?
So as an editor, and you've seen many papers on your desk, you can be a better judge in this question than most people. How do you see the culture of IB scholarship changing over time? How was it before? How is it now moving to?
Yeah, I think the what I see as a culture in management research more generally is more and more fractionalization in terms of people create smaller and smaller areas of specialization, and people don't communicate with each other across the areas. And I think that is a problem. As IB scholars, we are by definition a little bit cross-functional, cross-disciplinary, at least as a field we are. Not every individual is, but most of us cross at least some geographies and probably also cross some disciplinary boundaries. And that's one of the reasons I like to be IB scholar, because you're actually quite broad, right? And especially if I'm thinking about the field as a whole, I'm thinking very much broader, and that's more interesting for me. Different people have different preferences, right? But for me, it's more interesting looking at the bigger picture. But in terms of time, over time, the more and more narrow specialization, again, together with more and more abstract and fine-grained theorizing, where I failed to realize the benefits of that, those are the trends that I think make management research potentially less relevant for people who are actually decision makers in politics or business.
Interesting. And last question in this segment is, which IB questions are overly studied, less fruitful going forward, especially for new dissertation stage people?
Yeah, well, I as I mentioned, my PhD was on entry modes in Eastern Europe. And at that time, it was interesting because it was a completely new field. A lot of companies were rushing in. I'm a bit tired of entry modes studies because maybe I've just seen too many decades of research on there, and the fine-tuning of that doesn't add value for me. And from a business perspective, companies are established around the world. So the entry mode is really only a decision in the context of an internationalization process. If you look at entrepreneurial firms, how they internationalize, but then it makes much more sense to look at it from a process perspective and from a catch-up perspective, or the young entrepreneurial firm being the focus rather than entry mode as an abstract. From the multinational enterprise perspective, the much more important question is how you manage a subsidiary. How do you, as a subsidiary manager, how do you engage with the local context? How do you engage with your global headquarters? How do you convince headquarters that what your local strategy teams thinks is the right thing to do to gain competitive advantage in your context actually is implemented, because you often need budget approval from people higher up the hierarchy who are outside the country. So there are lots of interesting questions around the subsidiary of the multinational enterprise that I personally find much more interesting than the simple question of how do you establish yourself in the first place. maybe I should add that this view is also informed by my experience of having lived in Shanghai for 6 years and have engaged with the representatives of the multinational enterprises who live there. Some of them live there for decades. And they are not interested about entry mode. They're interested about how do I deal with the increasing competition from local firms? How do we deal with the latest change in regulatory environment, which sometimes is getting more tough, sometimes it's easing up, opening up new opportunities, right? So maybe there is an entry decision in terms of how do I get into the market segment that has been newly liberalized or things like that. But that's only a small part of what the subsidiary is doing.
Perfect. Now, Klaus, the third segment is about you giving advice to young scholars or PhD students. What was the best advice you received when you were going through the process?
Do whatever you're interested in. I mean, it sounds very simple, and frankly, every career is highly idiosyncratic. So the key thing for a scholar to sustain yourself through the pressures and putting that extra time in and spending the weekends with your books instead of with sports or whatever else you're interested in, is you have to have questions you're really interested in, and the motivation has to come from the inside. And so if you are simply driven by functional sort of objectives, as in I need to publish a paper, therefore I do research, it's not going to motivate you to see through, to persist in doing it over a career, right? And so I think the most important thing is to identify areas you're really personally interested in, and if that evolves over the time of your career, so be it, right? You don't have to stick to one particular area because you started there. But ultimately, it is your own motivation that is the single most important driver of you achieving impactful research. And therefore, you need to sort of have a clear idea. And if you don't have that internal drive and certain questions you're interested in, then maybe you want to focus on it in a different career or in a different part of academic career, because some people mid-career decide they want to be primarily teacher, they want to be primarily executive education, or take over leadership roles within the university. I think those are very legitimate career decisions that people make in mid-career, right? And if you sort of don't have that passion for research anymore, or maybe you never had it, although if you never had it, you probably shouldn't be there in the first place. But if you sort of feel that I'd rather do something else, that there are other options that academics can go other than persisting with doing research.
Now, two questions came up from previous interviews, and some people in the audience sent a couple of emails. Two questions are really related. One is, when is the right time to pull the plug on a paper? As an editor, you might be more in a position to explain it better. And the second question is, how do you sell these ideas to difficult editors or difficult referees? And these students are asking a really interesting follow-up question on timing of pulling the plug and selling the idea. As an editor, what would you say?
When is the time to pull a plug? If I don't see the paper being really interesting, and it goes in a direction that I'm not interested in, the main challenge as a senior scholar is that you usually have junior scholars as co-authors. And so I would pull the plug in the moment that your junior person is no longer interested or not putting the effort in, because then the papers that I struggle with or where I'm not so motivated with, I'm doing it because of the co-author, because of the PhD student or the person I'm mentoring. And so the passion and the interest of the person I'm mentoring is key for keeping me motivated and involved, right? So if that junior person is no longer interested, maybe because they left academia and decided to be a different career, then I also would pull the plug. But then, of course, that relates to another question for senior person is, what are the sort of relationships where you don't want to invest further, or you'd rather work with other people. I mean, there is a limited number of papers I can do at any particular point in time. And so you also have to make decisions on sometimes cutting a relationship with the co-author who is not, it can be an intellectual depth issue, it can be a methodological rigor issue, but mostly it comes down to passion and commitment to actually put the work in, right? And if you feel that we're not getting anywhere, then maybe you should not continue that.
Last question. What is one question I should have asked you but didn't?
Question you should have asked me but you didn't. That's an interesting question. You should have asked me how I can be a scholar at the same time as I'm looking over a family.
Hello, how are you?
My daughter is also doing the fully virtual school, and that creates challenges for focusing on research. So I do see this as I mean, COVID is a challenge for all of us. I mean, sorry, the lockdown. So we're not, as a family, we're not affected directly by COVID, but we are in lockdown, and like a lot of people, we have a lot to deal with a lot of things. So the challenge for research is finding the time to concentrate on a research idea, which you can't do in blocks of 5 minutes.
True. How old is your daughter?
It was very close to my birthday, but I'm 5.
You just turned 5.
Well, great. I thought you would be maybe like 8 or 9. I thought you were a bit bigger.
Sure?
No, that's because Dad is carrying me.
Oh, Dad is carrying you. That's why she's so tall. But in terms of knowing how to deal with computers, you know, Erica knows much more than I did know at that age, because Erica also has a virtual school, right? So she knows how to raise her hand.
That's a gorgeous name, Erica. Let me ask a question to Erica. Erica, how is school? How is online school?
Good. What
How
do you
does
think
this?
about?
What is it? Erica, how does Playdate work over these online versions? Do you guys do Playdates?
No,
No?
not yet. But the teachers is arranging a play date for me and you, Kosh.
With one of the classmates?
He knows how to play a piano, and he played Happy Birthday
when you had a birthday party?
And I ate that chocolate cake.
Oh, that was fun, having a birthday party with your school, right? Because the nice thing is you get the birthday cake and you get to eat it all by yourself. And all the other people are singing songs, but you don't have to share the birthday cake, right? Because you can't send it through the computer. That was very funny, right?
Erica, I have a question for you. Who's your best friend?
Oh, good question.
Good question.
My best friend was Sen, but now he's not in my class anymore because, and it was Amy who was in that class, but now she is in the real class. So the only best friend in the class right now is you, Kosh.
That's not Ryan.
Yeah, Ryan is my best friend, but you, Kosh.
You like Lucas better than Ryan?
Because I know you, Kosh, is 5, but I don't know how old Ryan is.
Ryan is younger. You like the older boys?
Because I like the kids which is the same age I am, even if they're a little taller.
You can always learn something from the people a little bit older than you are, right? Okay.
So
all right, you go back. Okay, bye. Okay.
Well, Klaus, thank you so much. This was
you need to find the right place to cut off at the end. It's okay to introduce Erica at the end, but you probably don't want to have the entire conversation that we just had, right?
I think this was very interesting and very I learned a lot from America. So thank you.
But for purposes of this video, you just have a very tiny snippet of that at the end,
Sure.
right? Rather than the whole conversation we had.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Bye.
Bye-bye.